Valerie Pape was a glamorous divorcee.
She was blonde, she was petite, a very, very fashionable lady.
She had this beautiful French accent.
And she came to America hoping to put her failed marriage behind her.
She had some friends in Scottsdale, and she jumped on a plane to make a life here.
One that would be even more upscale and dazzling than what she left behind, thanks to Ira Pomerantz.
He was the playboy kind of guy.
He had airplanes. He had several Jaguars.
Their courtship was swift.
On their first date, he took her to Las Vegas.
But barely 4 years later, Ira would suddenly disappear.
I said, Valerie, listen, we need to put in a missing persons report.
Was the wealthy playboy on the run?
He was involved with bad people.
Did Valerie know more than she let on?
The delivery driver had seen something being put into the dumpster.
And would the missing man ever be found?
It was a torso. No arms, no legs, no head.
There's no dental. There's no way to identify the body.
Scottsdale, Arizona is a glitzy town of 200,000, just northeast of Phoenix.
It'd be like the Beverly Hills of Phoenix, I would say. Upper class, kind of shopping, art, restaurants, jewelry stores, and salons.
Scottsdale is the place where people want to live, the place where the movers and shakers live.
People like 60-year-old Ira Pomerantz, a successful businessman who enjoyed everything that life in Scottsdale had to offer.
He loved to play golf. He was a pilot. He had a plane. He loved people. He loved being around people. We were very, very close. We were good buddies.
Which is why Louis Milazzo was worried about Ira on the morning of January 26, 2000. The old friends hadn't spoken in almost a week, which was unusual.
I mean, I spoke to him 4 times a week, and I was concerned.
So concerned that Louis contacted Ira's wife, 47-year-old Valerie Pape.
I called Valerie. I said to her, "Where's Ira?" She said, "I don't know." And I said, "When was the last time you saw him?" She said, "I think I saw him late Sunday, but I don't know where he is. He didn't come home." And I said, "He didn't come home?" She said, "Yeah, he probably went to Las Vegas or something."
Ira would sometimes leave town without warning.
That's really how he had lived his entire life. Very spontaneous, always on a whim, taking off to Vegas, just doing things for himself.
Still, Louis wanted to make sure nothing had happened to his friend.
I said, "Valerie, listen, I think we need to put in a missing persons report."
Was Ira's friend simply overreacting? Was it possible he'd really gone to Vegas? Or was Louis right to think that something was wrong with Ira? Something bad enough to cut off all contact? The police would eventually find the answer, and Valerie would lead them to it. Born in 1952, Valerie started life far from Arizona, in a picturesque town in the French countryside.
She was the daughter of a French doctor, the person who really hadn't had to struggle a great deal in life, who was born with the silver spoon, essentially.
She was kind of prim and proper, brought up that way.
Growing up, she attended the best Catholic boarding school in the province.
She called it a white glove school in France, which meant they wore white gloves with their uniform.
After graduation, Valerie married well and moved to Paris.
She was married to a wealthy man, a certified public accountant. They lived in the Paris suburbs. They had 2 homes. She would take vacations to Italy, where she enjoyed winter sports. She was a lady of means.
And she was everything a sophisticated Parisian woman was supposed to be.
She was blonde, she was petite. She was a woman who would be noticed. A very, very fashionable lady.
She always had beautiful clothes on, designer clothes, designer bags. She always was dressed to the T's.
She was basically living the good life in France.
But there was one thing lacking in Valerie's life: children.
She'd always wanted a baby and could not conceive. And that always made her very unhappy because she wanted kids really bad.
Eventually, Valerie and her husband adopted a little girl.
She loved her daughter very much.
But just as it appeared that Valerie finally had it all, her life fell apart. She and her husband divorced, and the final settlement cost Valerie her daughter.
When her and the husband divorced, she lost custody completely, had no visitation rights.
Over 40 and suddenly alone, Valerie decided to start over in the United States.
She had some friends in Scottsdale. She jumped on a plane, I guess, and came over and tried to make a life here.
Once settled into Scottsdale, Valerie began taking cosmetology classes at the local community college.
She had this idea of opening a very prestigious salon in downtown Scottsdale.
And thanks to Ira Pomerantz, Valerie would realize her dream and more. "13 years older than Valerie, Ira wasn't from Arizona either.
He was from Monticello, New York, and then Brooklyn.
He'd been married and divorced twice, failed marriages that were largely Ira's fault, according to the youngest of his 2 daughters.
Marriage is probably the most difficult relationship there is. So if you're not willing to work at that relationship every day, it's going to fall apart. And my father being a free spirit and not wanting to be told where to be or what to do, I think he had issues.
However, even as Ira struggled in his personal life, his career flourished.
He was in the garment industry. He imported garments, sold the fabric to manufacturers.
Manufacturers like his old friend, Louis Milazzo.
We were in the same industry, and over time we became friends, and the relationship just grew.
And when Louis moved to Scottsdale in 1992, he convinced Ira to follow.
Louis told my dad it's much more kicked back and you can kind of semi-retire.
Ira was in his early 50s when he made the move to Scottsdale, but unlike Louis, he wasn't ready to retire just yet.
He went and started up some businesses, restaurant businesses, nightclub businesses.
Although owning nightclubs was more than just a business venture for Ira, it was also a chance to make the most of his midlife crisis.
He was a playboy kind of guy. Women were attracted to him. He was a good-looking man, and, he really didn't have a problem getting a date.
There were plane rides, there were fancy dinners, drive around in his Ferrari. He lived a lavish lifestyle.
However, it wasn't Ira's flashy car or playboy lifestyle that led him to Valerie. In 1994, as part of her cosmetology courses, Valerie volunteered to cut and style hair for residents at a Scottsdale assisted living facility. And one of her clients just happened to be Ira's elderly father, who'd moved to Scottsdale soon after his son.
Ira's father asked Valerie about her marital status, and when he discovered that she was single, he told her that I have a son who you have to meet.
The result was a whirlwind courtship.
On their first date, he took her to Las Vegas. She had never seen anything like it before, all the glitz and glamour of the strip.
Valerie, with her conservative Catholic upbringing and upper-middle-class Parisian background, had never met a playboy like Ira before.
He had a boyish charm about him.
He was a lot of fun to be around, definitely like the life of the party.
And Ira was just as taken with Valerie.
And the way she spoke, she had this beautiful French accent. I think, it was alluring to him.
Within 6 months, Valerie had moved into Ira's condo, and within a year, he bought the couple a house in a fashionable Scottsdale neighborhood.
It's huge, 4,000 square foot home with a pool, and, it was everything for Valerie.
Her house was gorgeous. Persian rugs, a lot of wrought iron, very well decorated.
And soon after buying Valerie a home, Ira bought her an engagement ring.
They got married at the house.
The wedding, held before an intimate gathering of family and friends, was in November of 1995.
Ira, any last words here?
So long, it was nice knowing you. Moving on to bigger
You may now kiss the bride.
And soon after saying "I do," Ira helped Valerie achieve her dream of opening a salon, too, in Scottsdale's trendy Old Town.
It was, it was like in the heart of Scottsdale. It was a happening place.
He leased the place and did whatever they had to do to fix it up.
Although, at the last minute, the salon almost failed to get off the ground.
She was supposed to open it with the girl from beauty school, and that fell through.
In need of a partner to help handle the workload and with few contacts in Scottsdale, Valerie turned to an old friend from France, a man named Michel.
They knew each other when they were children. She called him in France and said, "Come over, you have to help me." So he came over to own half the business with her.
With Michel's last-minute assistance, the salon opened as planned. And thanks to its upscale French flair, it was an instant success.
The salon was very popular. It was always busy when I was in there.
Besides hair, we had a lot of art and a lot of very boutique type clothing. We had a lot of parties in the atrium. We'd have a band, stuff like that.
And by the end of 1999, 2 years after Ira invested in her salon, Valerie had made a name for herself in Scottsdale.
She was well loved in the community.
But would she be able to hang on to her status and her salon after Ira suddenly disappeared? Coming up, a delivery driver makes a gruesome discovery.
It was a torso. No arms, no legs, no head.
But are the dismembered remains Ira's?
There are no prints. There's no dental. There's no way to identify the body.
It was January 26, 2000, when 47-year-old Valerie Pape walked into the Scottsdale, Arizona Police Department to report her husband, 60-year-old Ira Pomerantz, missing.
I called her and asked her to file the missing persons report, and I met Valerie at Scottsdale Police and filled out a missing persons report. She showed up and was in and out in 5 minutes, fill out the report, and she said, maybe you went to Vegas to have a good time.
And knowing Ira, Valerie may have had a point.
My father had a zest for fun and was more of a free spirit and wanted to come and go as he pleases.
However, Ira's friend Louis Milazzo and his daughters were still concerned. None of them had heard from Ira in almost a week.
Maybe your dad flew off to Vegas to have a good time, but that's maybe a couple of days worth of no calls, but not this is like the 5th day or 4th day or something. Like there's something wrong.
And that wasn't the only reason they were worried. According to friends, Valerie and Ira had always kept separate schedules.
He would work at night. See, he owned nightclubs. So he would start work at 2 in the afternoon and work till very late, where Valerie would be in bed at 10 o'clock. So they had separate lives. She was up and gone before Ira ever got up during the day.
And the distance between them only grew when Valerie opened her salon, especially once her friend and business partner Michel arrived from France.
He was a family friend from a long time. They knew each other when they were children. So he had come over to help her with the salon.
And in return, Valerie and Ira helped Michel make the transition to America.
He needed a place to live, and of course she insisted that he move in.
The house was big enough where he could have his own area.
It was an unusual arrangement, but it appeared to work.
They all connected, and my father seemed to like Michelle.
Plus, since Ira was always working late at his clubs, having Michelle around meant that Valerie had someone to escort her to the gallery openings, cocktail parties, and other events that the salon owner's socialite status demanded.
She liked to go out to nice restaurants. She liked to socialize with her friends. She liked to be involved and know what was going on with people.
The friend accompanied her to a lot of these things that Valerie liked to do.
In fact, Valerie and her friends spent so much time together at parties and events that Scottsdale's society gossip soon took notice.
It looked like to a lot of people out there that they were the couple.
According to his friend Louis Milazzo, It was starting to look that way to Ira, too.
Ira had told me, what kind of relationship am I having? She spends more time with him, and the relationship just became estranged at that point. He would say, I feel like an outsider in my own house now. As a matter of fact, he moved to a separate bedroom.
And according to Ira's attorney, that was only a preliminary step.
I am a certified family law divorce specialist in the state of Arizona. And he had discussed filing of an action to terminate the marriage.
He was saying that he might have made a mistake. And one way or the other, I just want to end this peacefully.
And according to Lewis, what Ira told him wasn't the only reason he was worried. It was when he'd told him to.
That's the last time I saw him. He was missing the next day.
But did that mean Ira had gone off to Vegas alone to put some distance between himself and Valerie before filing for divorce? Or was it possible things hadn't ended as peacefully as Ira intended? The next morning, less than 24 hours after Valerie and Lewis reported Ira missing, a driver was making an early delivery to a supermarket in Mesa, a Phoenix suburb just south of Scottsdale.
This was like 5 o'clock in the morning. It was very early in the morning in January. It would have been dark. And there was a delivery man, and he was parked behind this supermarket. Basically, he saw this woman pull up. He saw her get out of her Jaguar, and he saw her pop open the trunk and lift up a very heavy-looking object and throw it into the dumpster. And then, take off.
The whole thing looked suspicious to the delivery driver, but he had a schedule to keep.
He actually continued on his route, finished his route.
And it was only after finishing the day's deliveries and talking over his suspicions with another driver that he decided to find out if the mystery woman had really been up to something.
They both went back and checked the dumpster.
And they quickly found what the woman had left behind.
It was in a plastic bag, looked like a garbage bag, and it looked suspicious.
So suspicious that one of the delivery drivers decided that rather than open the bag, he'd poke it with a knife first.
It was an X-Acto knife, probably what he used to cut his packages open.
The blade went through the plastic easily, and when it came out, the driver's suspicions appeared to be confirmed.
He saw blood on the knife. That time, he, of course, figured that it was something that needed to be reported to the police. So he flagged down an officer that he saw in the area that happened to be driving through the area and asked him to come check it out.
And when the officer opened the garbage bag, he made a gruesome discovery.
It was a torso. And when I say torso, literally no arms, no legs, no head.
The head had been severed at the base of the neck. He had been cut at both shoulders, and his bottom half had been cut at the waist.
And his identity was a mystery.
When you find a torso from a criminal perspective, there are no prints, there's no dental, there's no way to identify a body. You can get a gender, and that's it. Unless the body contains visible scars, visible tattoos, something to match up with a missing persons report.
The police didn't have any easy way of finding out who the dead man was, but thanks to their witness, they might be able to identify the woman who disposed of the remains.
The delivery driver said that she appeared to be very slight, somewhere around 5 feet. He estimated her weight at about 100 pounds, 105 pounds, somewhere along in there.
She was fashionably dressed, wearing a jumpsuit and high heels.
The quick-thinking delivery driver also provided a detailed description of the woman's car.
The car was a Jaguar, and he also got us the license plate, which he had written down.
So while the medical examiner's office began the grim task of removing the torso from the dumpster so that they could autopsy and hopefully identify the dead man, the investigators followed up on the only lead they had.
We ran the plate as a part of our investigation, and it came back to a woman named Valerie Pape.
Coming up, the investigators locate a possible crime scene.
The police found a bullet lodged in the wall.
But that's not the most gruesome find.
This would have been an excellent tool to use for the actual dismemberment.
By Friday, January 28, 2000, it had been 24 hours since police had found a man's dismembered torso in a dumpster outside a Mesa, Arizona grocery store.
We were alerted by a citizen, actually was a delivery driver, who said that he had seen something being put into the dumpster by a lady when he was making a delivery.
And the witness's tip led the police to Valerie Pape's salon in Scottsdale's Tony Old Town neighborhood.
The delivery man wrote down the plate, gave it to the police, and that's why they arrested Valerie.
They got her about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't know if she was done for the day or in the middle of a haircut, but they came and arrested her.
Not only had a witness placed the 47-year-old at the scene of the crime, Valerie had reported her husband, 60-year-old Ira Pomerantz, missing less than 24 hours before the witness spotted her, throwing what turned out to be a man's dismembered body into the dumpster. But did that mean the body was her husband? The missing persons investigators had already uncovered trouble in Valerie and Ira's marriage.
They were estranged, and we thought that she had a lover.
But for the moment, the police had no way of identifying the dismembered torso.
We didn't have any fingerprints or any facial features or things like that.
Confirming the body's identity would have to wait on an autopsy and DNA tests. But since she'd allegedly been seen dumping the body, the investigators had more than enough probable cause to question Valerie.
We contacted Valerie to try and establish if she would, at least admit that she was in the area, which would give us a starting point for the investigation.
At first, Valerie tried to deny that she was the one who dumped the torso.
We never believed her from the beginning, based on the witness account that they had seen a woman dumping the torso.
And when the investigators made it clear that she'd basically been caught red-handed, Valerie's story suddenly changed.
What she discloses is that she came home and the body was there.
She had found her husband on January 24th, that she had came home in the morning, found her husband in a pool of blood, laying face up on the kitchen floor.
But if that were true, if she had come home to find Ira dead on the kitchen floor, why not call 911?
She said that she did not call the police because she was afraid.
She was afraid that she would be accused, and she did what she did because she thought she was protecting herself.
And according to Valerie, that fear led her to tell her husband's friend Louis Milazzo that Ira had probably gone to Vegas and to file a missing persons report.
All of those things are just so far-fetched. I mean, you look at her, you look at the body, you look at the circumstances involved, and you say, come on. I mean, really?
Because what was more incriminating, finding your husband dead or getting caught dumping his dismembered body?
She clammed up when it came to talking about the dismemberment. She lawyered up, and so they had to end the interview right there.
However, she was adamant about one thing.
She denied responsibility for the murder completely.
Not that her denials made any impression on the investigators, who proceeded to book Valerie into the Maricopa County Jail.
She was charged with first-degree murder.
It all clued in. They were in the middle of a divorce, so there was a lot of, anger and resentment between the two of them.
But while the investigators suspected the dismembered torso was Ira's, could they prove it? A few days after Valerie's arrest, the autopsy provided the answer.
They just took our DNA with swabs, and then they told us we all matched, and it was our dad, and that was just devastating news.
It all felt very surreal, like this only happens in a movie.
The torso's identity wasn't all that the autopsy revealed, however.
Striations that they saw on the body indicated to them that they thought the body had been killed earlier and had been frozen.
And while Ira's head had been severed at the neck, there were traces of a gunshot wound just below the cut.
He had been killed by a gunshot to the back of the neck.
They theorized that the bullet had gone into his head by the trajectory of the wound.
But where was the rest of Ira's body?
If she had been doing what we anticipated, she was driving from dumpster to dumpster, it would have been impossible to find a body at that point in time, given all of the pickups and the large area of the city she could have covered.
Which meant the investigators were extremely fortunate that any of Ira's body had been found.
The person who saw her putting it in the dumpsters, had he not been there, had he not seen that, we may not have even discovered the torso in the trash bin prior to it being taken away and dumped.
Without a body, it's very hard to prosecute a murder.
But could the police find the murder weapon? In the days following Valerie's arrest, the Mesa and Scottsdale police served a search warrant on the couple's Scottsdale home.
Apparently there were guns all throughout the house.
That wasn't the only place they found guns either.
The police found a gun hidden in the back seat of the Jaguar.
But was the gun from Valerie's car or any of the guns found in the house the murder weapon? Since no bullets had been recovered from Ira's body, it was difficult to say, although the investigators did have one tantalizing clue.
During the investigation, the police found a bullet that was lodged in the wall of the home.
The bullet wasn't just in any wall either. It was in the kitchen, exactly where Valerie claimed she'd discovered Ira's dead body, leading the police to believe they'd found the crime scene.
They believed that the bullet that they recovered from the kitchen was fired from the gun that they found in Valerie Pape's car.
The gun and the bullet both went to the crime lab for ballistics testing, but they weren't the only intriguing pieces of evidence that the search warrant produced.
They had found receipts for a reciprocating saw.
This would have been an excellent tool to use for the actual dismemberment.
The police never found the saw, but she had bought it with her credit card. And according to the date on the receipt, she bought it before Ira's murder.
If you look at the fact that she bought the reciprocating saw a month before the body was dismembered, that seems to imply some premeditation.
Dismemberment seemed like the only way she could have gotten Ira's body out of the house, too.
Ira was probably 5'10", 5'11", probably close to 200 pounds. Valerie was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, 100 pounds, tops.
And even Ira's dismembered torso alone had almost been more than Valerie could handle.
The eyewitness said it was a big struggle for her just to get it out of the car.
Which left the investigators pondering one more possibility.
So we believe to remove it from the house, she had to have someone helping her.
There's no way she could have done this on her own.
And as far as the investigators were concerned, there was one obvious suspect.
She had this friend, Michelle, who was conveniently staying with her.
We believe that they had a relationship past being friends, and that was one of the reasons why we thought that she committed the murder to begin with.
But had Valerie's friend been more than a possible motive for killing Ira?
The police thought he may have helped her out with at least the dismemberment.
But while the police suspected it, proving it was an entirely different story.
There was no hard evidence that there was a accomplice involved.
However, when the ballistics test on the bullet embedded in her kitchen wall came back from the crime lab, the evidence against Valerie kept piling up.
They concluded that it had been fired from a gun that was found in her car.
The ballistic evidence, the reciprocating saw, and the body in the dumpster. Taken together, it was more than enough for the grand jury.
The grand jury comes down with a first-degree murder indictment.
But since the prosecutors couldn't prove that the bullet in the wall was the one that killed Ira, would it be enough for a conviction?
This is all circumstantial evidence because there was no witness.
Coming up, the investigators dig into Valerie and Ira's finances.
Some of his business dealings had went south.
And that leads them to wonder, had the Vegas high roller gotten in over his head in a desperate attempt to keep afloat?
He was involved with bad people. He owed him money.
In February of 2000, 48-year-old Valerie Pape sat in Arizona's Maricopa County Jail, held without bond while awaiting trial for the murder of her husband, Ira Pomerantz.
From a prosecutor's side, she was a French citizen. She had committed first-degree murder. It gave her every reason in the world to flee. So the court decided that she was non-bondable.
But was there another way Valerie could get out of jail, or at least out of an American jail? Valerie's friend Michelle, after being cleared of any involvement in Ira's murder, brought her case to the attention of the French consulate's office, who took an immediate interest.
First-degree murder could have put death penalty on the table.
And since France had outlawed the death penalty, that could have caused an international incident if the prosecutors pushed for it.
The decision that was made was, okay, we're not going to seek the death penalty. We're going to go for first-degree murder without the death penalty, which means life in prison if convicted.
It was a bitter disappointment for Ira's daughter, Stacy.
I was very upset about that because as far as I could see, they have enough of the criteria to seek the death penalty. I thought they met that criteria easily.
Although for the prosecutors, their first priority was securing a conviction, and they felt they had a strong case against Valerie.
At that point in time, the prosecution's case is that was planned, and evidence of that planning was obviously the purchase of a saw weeks before the murder.
But as Valerie's trial date approached, would new evidence put the prosecution's case in jeopardy? At the time of Valerie's arrest, what motivated the murder had appeared obvious.
Our Irish family thought that Valerie was a gold digger, that the only reason that she was with her dad was because of the fact that he had money.
And the police suspected that she had killed Ira because the couple was heading for a divorce.
If they were still married when he was dead, she stood to have his money.
That's what the investigators and prosecutors believed. But when they looked into Ira's finances, they made a surprising discovery.
Ira had filed for bankruptcy. Some of his business dealings had went south. And there's no question that there was some financial duress going on in the home.
In fact, while preparing for trial, Valerie's defense team and supporters hinted that Ira, who'd made his fortune in New York's garment trade and made regular trips to Vegas, might have gotten in over his head trying to stave off bankruptcy.
He was involved with bad people, is what I think was the problem. He owed him money.
Was it possible Valerie was telling the truth, that someone else had killed Ira?
She said that she had found him dead in the kitchen. She did not say that she shot him. She said she found him dead.
But even as Valerie claimed she had nothing to do with his murder, she made a shocking accusation about her late husband.
Valerie had reported there was domestic violence going on in the home.
Ira's family was outraged.
I was reading this article, one of the first articles that hit the paper, specifically the part where Valerie states that she was the victim of domestic abuse. I was just like, what?
In all the years that I knew Ira, the one thing he wasn't was violent. He just wasn't violent at all.
But while Ira's family and friends dismissed the claim, Valerie's accusation did win her considerable sympathy in the community.
Valerie had a lot of friends in Scottsdale. She was very well liked. She hung out with all the right people. And so she had her group of cheerleaders. Ira had been a longtime businessman here in Arizona, and so he had his following. And there was a huge dispute over whether or not she actually was a victim of domestic violence.
And some of Valerie's friends said they had seen the evidence.
There was a day that Valerie came into work kind of upset. And I said, what's wrong? And she goes, look, I have bruises. And she lifted up her skirt way up high. She had a short skirt on. And she showed me the bruises. And I said, that's crazy. That's not right.
Thanks to the defense, pictures of a bruised and battered Valerie even made it into the local paper.
They showed this picture with her having 2 black eyes.
But was the picture really evidence of abuse? Or was it simply a calculated piece of character assassination on the part of Valerie's supporters? According to his daughter, the photograph had nothing to do with domestic violence.
I I saw the dates that she said this was from. I called right away and told the newspaper, I don't believe that the domestic abuse was the cause of these black eyes, but rather the facelift that she had the day before that picture was taken. I gave them the information that they needed to check it out, and they retracted the whole domestic abuse thing.
But did Ira's daughter know the whole truth about her father? The bogus facelift picture wasn't all that the defense had.
There are records of, the police showing up to the house for various reasons.
Most of the calls were for domestic disturbances.
The scenario with Valerie, she would instigate an argument and, there would be yelling and there'd be shouting and fighting and two people in an argument. But I don't think it would have gone physical.
He never hit us. And, never hit my mom, never hit his second wife, and never was violent with Valerie either.
That's what Ira's daughters claimed. But Valerie's attorneys also had documents suggesting that what was going on was more than just a shouting match.
Valerie had taken out an order of protection against Ira.
The protection order dated to 1999.
It was well before the murder, which was verified by the police department. But there were no other police reports reference any sort of abuse.
Still, the order of protection, the couple's history of domestic disturbances, and Valerie's claims of abuse were enough to give the prosecutors pause.
Domestic violence might have been a stumbling point. You could see why a jury would not find first-degree murder.
If the jury comes back not guilty, it's not guilty. She walks, she goes free, and there's no justice for the victim.
So in the summer of 2002, the prosecutors decided to offer Valerie a deal.
They were going to plea it out to second-degree murder.
The plea agreement terms allow her to be sentenced for anywhere between 10 and 16 years in prison.
Considering what Valerie had done to Ira, his family didn't think 16 years was nearly enough, but they resigned themselves to the deal.
The DA's office and was really pushing this, saying, there's no guarantees with a trial. It could go either way, and it's a big crapshoot. And I was just like,
Would Valerie take the deal, or would she risk going to trial? In the end, she ran into the same dilemma that dogged the prosecutors.
You have one shot at a trial. That's it. You have one shot.
So rather than risk going to prison for life, Valerie Pape appeared in Maricopa County Superior Court on August 20th, 2002, and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder.
It took almost 3 years from the time of her arrest until the time that she pled guilty.
It was a shocking reversal, considering Valerie had always proclaimed her innocence, a stance she strangely tried to maintain, even while pleading guilty to murder.
Her words were that she fired a gun in the direction of Ira Pomerantz and hit him. And I'd never heard wording like that, and it sort of like took a little bit of the culpability away from her. It seemed to me, at least, that she wasn't fully admitting to it.
There was no remorse or taking responsibility for what happened. I think, she took the plea because she was going to get something, and that was the shortest jail sentence she could get.
And then, when Ira's daughter made her own plea to Valerie during her victim's impact statement to the court, Valerie had even less to say.
I turned around to her directly, and I'm like, just tell us where the rest of his body is so we can bury him whole, And she just looked at me dumbly and blankly and didn't say anything.
It may have been a mistake.
The judge was not too happy that she never said where the rest of the body was.
And his displeasure may have been reflected in Valerie's sentence.
The judge gave her the harshest he could give. She ended up getting sentenced to 16 years.
Coming up, will a guilty plea be enough to keep Valerie in prison?
The U.S. and other countries have these treaties where they exchange prisoners.
They were very, very worried that France would release her on parole.
By 2006, it had been 4 years since Valerie Pape pled guilty to the murder of her husband, Ira Pomerantz, a plea that surprised her friends and supporters.
She had to snap or have some kind of a breakdown to do what she did, because that's not the Valerie that I knew and loved at all.
She's a very wonderful person and was a very good friend to me. So it would be hard for me to think of her doing anything that would hurt a human being.
In prison for second-degree murder, the 54-year-old had almost 10 years remaining on her 16-year sentence.
She was given credit for, the nearly 3 years she spent in a county jail.
But would Valerie, who was a French citizen, stay in an American prison?
In 2006, there was an effort to have Valerie transferred to France to serve out the rest of her sentence.
The U.S. and other countries have these treaties where they exchange prisoners.
That didn't make the transfer any less of a surprise to Ira's family, though.
When Ira Pomerantz's daughters heard about this, they just were aghast.
I was like, oh my God, the courts here have no say-so over what they do with the prisons there.
They were very, very worried that France would release her on parole.
I was on the phone immediately. Like, I'm like, call them, tell them, no, wait, don't let them do this, don't let them do this.
We found out about it like in the nick of time, and she was already en route back to France.
The state of Arizona had basically signed off on this, and she had been transferred to a federal holding facility.
But once the Arizona authorities found out that the family objected, the transfer came to a halt.
She was returned to Arizona and served out the rest of her sentence.
Although at the age of 62, Valerie finally did go home.
So Valerie completed her sentence in February 2016, and she was deported back to France. And apparently that's where she's living now.
I don't know what she's doing in France now. I really try not to think much about her. It's disappointing. I know this is our legal system, but, in this situation, my father being murdered, I don't feel there was true justice for what happened to him.
The rain had stopped hours before anyone found the envelope. It was buried beneath a layer of forgotten evidence boxes inside an aging police archive in Michigan, a place where thousands of reports, photographs, and case files sat untouched for decades. A place where the past was supposed to stay buried. But inside that dusty room, under the weak flickering light of the storage hallway, investigators discovered something that would reopen a nightmare from 1979. A single piece of evidence, a name, a fingerprint, and a mystery that had haunted an entire community for 46 years. For decades, the disappearance of 27-year-old Elizabeth Liz Harper remained one of Michigan's most disturbing cold cases. A case that police officers were tired with. A case families whispered about. A case that became a permanent scar on a small town where everyone remembered the night she vanished. On a cold October evening in 1979, Elizabeth Harper left her workplace just after 9 p.m. She was seen walking toward her car. She never made it home. The next morning, her vehicle was discovered abandoned near an old service road surrounded by dense woods outside a quiet Michigan township. The driver's door was unlocked. The keys were still inside. Her purse was sitting on the passenger seat. Her wallet was there. Her identification was there. Her entire life was left behind. Except Elizabeth. There was no sign of a struggle. No witnesses. No clear explanation. Only a vehicle sitting alone beneath the trees, waiting for someone to discover the truth hidden inside. At first, investigators believed Elizabeth may have left voluntarily. Maybe she met someone. Maybe she needed time away. Maybe she was planning to return. But those theories collapsed quickly. Elizabeth Harper was known as someone who never disappeared without telling anyone. She had a close relationship with her family. She had plans for the future. She had no reason to abandon everything she owned and vanish into the darkness. The search began immediately. Police officers moved through the surrounding forest with flashlights, cutting through the cold morning fog. Volunteers walked through fields and abandoned properties. Helicopters scanned miles of wooded terrain. Every path was checked. Every abandoned building was searched. Every possible lead was followed. But Elizabeth was gone. The town changed overnight. People who had lived there for generations suddenly looked differently at their neighbors. Doors were locked earlier. Conversations became quieter. Parents warned their children not to walk alone after sunset. The disappearance became more than a missing person case. It became a warning, a reminder that someone could vanish without explanation. The investigation exploded across local headlines. Young Michigan woman missing after night shift. Family begs for answers. Police search intensifies as mystery deepens. No leads, no suspect, no explanation. But behind the newspaper headlines was a family living through unimaginable uncertainty. Elizabeth's mother kept the porch light on every night, not because she believed Elizabeth was coming home, because she refused to believe she wasn't. Every phone call brought a moment of panic. Every knock on the door created impossible hope. Every unidentified person reported missing somewhere in the country brought another wave of fear. Years passed, then decades, and the answers never came. The original investigation produced hundreds of interviews. Friends were questioned. Co-workers were questioned. Strangers who claimed to have seen something were questioned. But every road led nowhere. The case slowly disappeared from public attention. The newspapers stopped printing updates. The television cameras left. The investigators moved on to other cases. And Elizabeth Harper became another name added to the growing list of Michigan cold cases. But inside the police department, the file was never truly forgotten. Detective Mark Reynolds was one of the last investigators assigned to review the case before his retirement. He had spent 30 years chasing answers in cases most people had already given up on. He believed cold cases were not dead cases. They were sleeping cases, waiting for the right moment, the right technology, the right discovery. And in 2025, that moment arrived. A new forensic review program began examining decades-old evidence from unsolved investigations across Michigan. Advances in DNA analysis had transformed criminal investigations. Evidence once considered useless could now reveal information impossible to uncover in previous generations. Old blood samples, tiny biological traces, forgotten fingerprints. Evidence that had been collected before modern technology existed was suddenly valuable again. The Harper case was placed back on the list. Investigators opened the original evidence box. Inside were photographs from the 1979 crime scene, handwritten interview notes, old reports, and a collection of items taken from Elizabeth's abandoned vehicle. Among them was something investigators had nearly overlooked, a small piece of paper recovered from the passenger side floor. At the time, it appeared meaningless, a simple receipt. Nothing unusual, nothing that seemed connected to a crime. But decades later, forensic specialists noticed something different, a partial fingerprint. Faint, incomplete, almost invisible. But there, the fingerprint had been photographed during the original investigation. In 1979, there was no database capable of identifying it, no digital system, no advanced comparison technology. The print was placed into evidence and forgotten until now. When forensic analysts enhanced the image, they realized they were looking at a usable fingerprint pattern, a fingerprint belonging to someone who had never been connected to the case, a fingerprint that did not belong to Elizabeth, a fingerprint that did not belong to any investigator who had documented the evidence. Someone else had touched that receipt. Someone else had been inside Elizabeth Harper's car. The discovery immediately changed everything. For 46 years, investigators had searched for a person. Now they had something more powerful. They had a piece of identity. The fingerprint was submitted for comparison. Days passed, then weeks, and investigators waited for the result because everyone understood what was at stake. A match could finally answer the question that had tortured a family for nearly half a century. Who was responsible? Where had Elizabeth gone? And why had someone gone to such lengths to keep the truth hidden? The result arrived on a quiet morning. A message appeared on the forensic database system. Investigators gathered around the screen. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because after 46 years of silence, the system had found a match. The fingerprint belonged to a man who had never been publicly named as a suspect. A man who had lived in Michigan for decades. A man whose connection to Elizabeth Harper's disappearance was about to shock everyone involved. The cold case that had refused to die was suddenly alive again, and the truth buried in 1979 was finally beginning to surface. The fingerprint match changed the entire direction of the investigation. For 46 years, the disappearance of Elizabeth Harper had existed in the darkest corner of Michigan's criminal history, a file filled with unanswered questions, faded photographs, and theories that had slowly disappeared with time. But now, one forgotten fingerprint had reopened everything. The name connected to that print was Thomas Keller, a man investigators had never seriously considered in 1979, a man whose name had never appeared in the headlines, a man who had lived quietly for decades while one family waited for answers that seemed impossible to find. When detectives pulled Keller's background records, they discovered something that immediately caught their attention. In 1979, Thomas Keller lived less than 10 miles from where Elizabeth Harper's abandoned vehicle was discovered. He was 31 years old at the time. He worked as a mechanic at a small repair shop outside town. And according to old records, he had access to several remote properties near the wooded area where Elizabeth's car was found. At first glance, it was only a coincidence. A local man living near the scene of a disappearance. Nothing more. But cold cases are often solved through details that once appeared meaningless. And investigators knew one thing. Coincidences have a way of becoming evidence when time removes the distractions. The first step was to reconstruct Thomas Keller's life in 1979. Detectives began digging through decades-old records, employment files, property documents, old newspaper archives, anything that could reveal whether Keller had ever crossed paths with Elizabeth Harper. Then they found something unexpected, a forgotten witness statement, buried inside the original case file. A statement from a woman who had worked at a nearby gas station in October 1979. She had told investigators that on the night Elizabeth disappeared, she noticed a dark-colored pickup truck parked near the entrance of the service road. She remembered seeing a man standing beside it, a man looking toward the woods. At the time, the description was too vague. The witness could not identify him. There was no license plate, no photograph, no physical evidence. The lead went nowhere. But when investigators reviewed the statement again, one detail stood out. The truck. Thomas Keller owned a dark-colored pickup truck in 1979, a vehicle matching the description. Suddenly, a forgotten page from an old investigation file became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. The investigators moved carefully. They knew the danger of cold cases. A person's memory changes. Evidence disappears. People die. Stories evolve. They needed facts, not assumptions. So they began examining Keller's history, and what they discovered created even more questions. Thomas Keller had moved several times after 1979. He left Michigan for a period of time, then returned years later. He had no major criminal convictions, no record that would immediately identify him as dangerous. To the outside world, he appeared ordinary. Neighbors described him as quiet, private, someone who kept to himself. But investigators found something disturbing. Several people who knew Keller in the late 1970s remembered him differently. They described him as unpredictable, aggressive, a man who could become angry without warning. One former co-worker told detectives that Keller often talked about women in a way that made people uncomfortable. Another remembered that Keller seemed unusually interested in the Elizabeth Harper investigation after she disappeared. At the time, nobody thought much about it. In a small town, everyone talked about the case. Everyone wanted answers. But now, decades later, those old memories carried a different weight. The investigation continued. Detectives contacted Keller. By this point, he was an elderly man. His health had declined. His life was far removed from the events of 1979. When investigators approached him, he appeared surprised that anyone was still asking about Elizabeth Harper. He denied knowing her. He denied ever being inside her vehicle, and he denied any involvement in her disappearance. But when detectives asked about the fingerprint found on the receipt, his reaction changed. For a moment, he said nothing. Then Keller offered an explanation. He claimed he may have met Elizabeth briefly. He claimed he might have helped her with a car problem. He claimed he had forgotten because so many years had passed. But investigators were not convinced because his story had changed. And changing stories often create new questions. If he knew Elizabeth, why had he never mentioned it during the original investigation? Why had his fingerprint been found inside her abandoned vehicle? Why had a witness described a truck matching his near location where her car was discovered? The answers were still hidden. But the investigation was moving faster than it had in decades. For Elizabeth's family, the news was overwhelming. They had spent 46 years living between hope and grief. They had attended birthdays without her, holidays without her, family gatherings with one empty chair. They had grown older while the person responsible remained unknown. Now, for the first time, there was a name, a possible suspect, a possible explanation. But there was also fear, because finding a suspect does not always mean finding the truth. Sometimes the hardest part of a cold case is not discovering who might be responsible. It is proving what happened. Investigators returned to the original crime scene. The old service road looked different after 4 decades. Trees had grown taller. The landscape had changed. Buildings had disappeared. But the silence remained. They walked the same area where Elizabeth's car had been found. They searched again, using technology that did not exist in 1979. Ground scanning equipment, modern forensic techniques, advanced evidence recovery methods. They were looking for anything. A buried object, a forgotten trace, a clue that had survived the passage of time. And then, beneath the soil near the old service road, investigators found something. Something that had been hidden for decades. Something connected to the night Elizabeth Harper vanished. The discovery was small, but the meaning behind it was enormous, because for the first time in 46 years, the investigation had moved beyond a disappearance. It had become a murder investigation, and the truth that had remained buried since 1979 was finally beginning to break through. The discovery beneath the old service road changed everything. For decades, investigators had searched for Elizabeth Harper as a missing person, a woman who vanished into the darkness, a case surrounded by uncertainty, unanswered questions, and painful silence. But now, the evidence was pointing towards something far more disturbing. Elizabeth had not simply disappeared. Someone had taken her. Someone had hidden the truth. And after 46 years, investigators were finally closing in on the person who may have been responsible. The item recovered near the abandoned service road was a small piece of fabric. At first, it appeared almost meaningless, a fragment buried beneath layers of soil and time. But forensic analysts believed it could be connected to Elizabeth's clothing from the night she vanished. The discovery was immediately sent for testing. The entire investigation paused, because everyone understood what this meant. If the evidence belonged to Elizabeth Harper, then the mystery surrounding her disappearance had taken a devastating turn. The woman her family had searched for since 1979 might finally have an answer, but that answer would come with a painful reality. The cold case was no longer about finding a missing person. It was about finding justice. Investigators reopened every piece of evidence from the original file. They looked at the case differently, not as a disappearance, but as a crime scene that had been misunderstood for decades. The abandoned vehicle, the receipt with a fingerprint, the witness who saw the pickup truck, the strange behavior of Thomas Keller. Every detail was placed under a microscope, and as detectives rebuilt the timeline, one question became impossible to ignore. What happened during the final hours of Elizabeth Harper's life? On the night of October 14, 1979, Elizabeth finished her shift at a local office building outside Lansing, Michigan. Co-workers remembered her as cheerful, focused, Someone who always had a plan. She was not the type of person who vanished without warning. She had responsibilities. She had people waiting for her. That night, she spoke with several co-workers before leaving. One co-worker later remembered seeing Elizabeth near the parking lot. She was standing beside her vehicle, and she was not alone. The witness originally believed the person with her was a friend, someone she knew, because Elizabeth did not appear afraid. She appeared to be having a conversation, but the witness could not identify the person. At the time, that detail seemed unimportant, a simple interaction before someone disappeared. But decades later, investigators realized that moment may have been the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth alive. The person standing beside her car may have been the final person to see her. The investigation turned back toward Thomas Keller. Detectives began examining his movements during the days surrounding Elizabeth's disappearance. They discovered that Keller had taken unusual time off work that week, a detail that had never been investigated. His employer's records showed he was absent the night Elizabeth vanished. Keller had previously told investigators that he was home that evening, but there was no evidence confirming his story. No witness, no receipt, no phone record, nothing. Just his own statement. Investigators knew that after 46 years, the smallest inconsistencies mattered. A forgotten conversation, a missing document, a changed story. Any one of those details could reveal the truth. Then came another shocking discovery. A former neighbor of Keller contacted police after seeing news reports about the reopened case. The woman, now in her 80s, told investigators something she had never shared before. In 1979, shortly after Elizabeth disappeared, she remembered seeing Keller cleaning the interior of his truck late at night. She said he appeared nervous. She remembered asking him what he was doing. According to her statement, Keller simply replied that he was getting rid of dirt. At the time, she thought nothing of it. People cleaned their vehicles. People acted strangely. Life continued. But decades later, that memory became another piece of the puzzle. Investigators now had a growing pattern, a fingerprint, a matching vehicle description, a witness placing Keller near the area, a timeline that raised questions, and a possible connection to Elizabeth Harper. But there was still one major obstacle. Thomas Keller continued to deny everything. When questioned again, he became defensive. He insisted the fingerprint proved nothing. He argued that he could have touched the receipt at any time. He claimed he might have helped Elizabeth with her vehicle, but he could not explain why he never told police, why he never came forward, why his name appeared nowhere in the original investigation. His answers created more suspicion, because investigators knew something important about cold cases. The truth often hides inside the details people choose not to explain. The media quickly picked up the story. The headlines spread across Michigan. 46-year-old cold case reopened after fingerprint breakthrough. New evidence points toward forgotten suspect. Family waits as Elizabeth Harper mystery returns to spotlight. The community that had once forgotten the case suddenly remembered. People who had grown up hearing about Elizabeth began sharing old memories. Former classmates spoke about her kindness. Neighbors remembered the fear that spread after her disappearance. The town had carried the weight of the mystery for generations. And now, after nearly half a century, they were watching the past return. But investigators knew they were running against time. Thomas Keller was older. His health was failing. If he was responsible, they needed answers before time took them away. Detectives searched for more evidence, more witnesses, more connections. And then they discovered something hidden inside another old evidence box. A photograph. A photograph taken just days after Elizabeth vanished. At first, it seemed like another ordinary crime scene image. But when forensic experts enhanced the photograph, they noticed something in the background. A vehicle. A dark pickup truck, parked near the area where Elizabeth's car was found. And investigators believed it matched a vehicle owned by Thomas Keller. The image was blurry. The license plate could not be read, but the shape, the model, the location, everything appeared to match. For 46 years, that truck had been nothing more than a forgotten detail. Now it had become one of the strongest links connecting Keller to the case. The investigation that had once gone cold was now moving at a terrifying speed. And as detectives dug deeper into Thomas Keller's past, they uncovered something even more disturbing. A secret, a connection, a piece of information that had remained hidden since 1979. Something that could finally reveal what happened to Elizabeth Harper on the night she vanished, because the fingerprint had opened the door. But behind that door was a truth far darker than anyone expected. The discovery of the photograph changed the investigation forever. For 46 years, the disappearance of Elizabeth Harper had been a mystery trapped inside a forgotten file. A case with no suspect, no answers, no justice. But now, the past was beginning to speak. The dark pickup truck captured in that old photograph became the center of the investigation. Detectives studied every detail: the shape of the vehicle, the position of the headlights, the damaged area near the rear bumper. The faded image from 1979 was enhanced using modern forensic technology, and the results sent a shock through the investigation team. The truck appeared to match the one registered to Thomas Keller, the same man whose fingerprint had been discovered inside Elizabeth's abandoned vehicle, the same man who claimed he barely knew her, the same man who had never been considered a serious suspect until decades after the crime. For investigators, the question was no longer whether Keller was connected to Elizabeth. The question was how deep that connection went. The case moved into a new phase. Detectives began rebuilding Elizabeth Harper's final day minute by minute. They needed to know every movement, every conversation, every person who crossed her path. Because in a cold case, time does not destroy the truth completely. It scatters it, and investigators must put the pieces back together. Elizabeth Harper started that October morning like any other day. She had plans. She had responsibilities. She had no idea that by the end of the night, her name would become attached to one of Michigan's most haunting mysteries. Friends remembered her as someone who cared deeply about others. She volunteered in her community. She regularly visited her parents. She had recently talked about changing jobs and starting a new chapter in her life. She was building a future that suddenly disappeared. The final confirmed hours of Elizabeth's life remained the most important part of the investigation. At approximately 8:45 p.m., she left work. A co-worker saw her walking toward the parking lot. Several minutes later, another person reported seeing a man near her vehicle, a detail that had been ignored for decades. The person was described as tall, wearing a dark jacket. Standing close to Elizabeth, the witness believed they were speaking calmly. There was no screaming, no obvious struggle, nothing that suggested danger. And that was one of the most disturbing parts of the case. Elizabeth may have known the person who approached her. She may have trusted them. She may have believed she was safe. Investigators now believe that trust may have been what allowed the crime to happen. The timeline continued. Elizabeth's vehicle was discovered the next morning, but new analysis suggested it may not have been abandoned immediately after she disappeared. The position of the car, the condition of the interior, the evidence left behind, all of it suggested someone had taken time to stage the scene, to create confusion, to make investigators look in the wrong direction. The person responsible did not simply disappear. They attempted to erase the truth, and for decades, they almost succeeded. But Thomas Keller's past was beginning to unravel. Investigators searched through old records from the late 1970s. They found that Keller had been questioned briefly during the original investigation, but only as a witness, not as a suspect. Why? Because at the time, police had no reason to focus on him. His name appeared only once. A simple note from an officer who recorded that Keller had been near the area several days after Elizabeth disappeared. Nothing more. The lead was abandoned. The file was closed. And the investigation moved on. But detectives reviewing the case in the modern era saw something different. They saw a missed opportunity. A moment when the truth was close, but not close enough. They contacted former officers who worked the original case. Many were shocked. Some admitted they never imagined the evidence would point back to someone who had been in their files all along. One retired investigator looked at the fingerprint evidence and said something that stayed with the team. The case didn't go cold because the evidence wasn't there. It went cold because we didn't know how to see it. Those words represented the reality of countless cold cases. Evidence can exist for decades, waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for someone to look again. As investigators continued examining Keller's background, they discovered another troubling detail. In the months after Elizabeth disappeared, Keller suddenly left the area. He moved to another state. He gave no clear reason. At the time, nobody connected it to the investigation. People moved. Jobs changed. Lives changed. But now, detectives questioned the timing. Why leave immediately after a local woman vanished? Why return years later? Why remain silent while Elizabeth's family searched for answers? Keller insisted the move had nothing to do with Elizabeth. He claimed he was simply looking for new opportunities. But investigators noticed something else. When questioned about Elizabeth, Keller remembered surprisingly little, almost too little. He claimed he did not remember meeting her. He did not remember the night she disappeared. He did not remember ever being near the service road. But he remembered enough to explain away the fingerprint. That contradiction became another piece of the puzzle. The investigation intensified. A search warrant was issued for Keller's remaining property. Inside, detectives found decades of personal belongings, old photographs, documents, objects from a lifetime. Most were meaningless, until one box caught investigators' attention. Inside that box was something connected to 1979, a small notebook. The pages were yellowed. The ink was faded. But inside were handwritten notes, dates, locations, names, and one entry that made investigators stop. October 14th, 1979, the exact night Elizabeth Harper disappeared. The entry was brief, only a few words. But those words created a new mystery, because they suggested Keller knew more about that night than he had admitted. The investigators now had a suspect. They had evidence. They had a timeline. But they still needed the one thing that mattered most: proof. Proof strong enough to answer the question that had haunted Michigan since 1979. What really happened to Elizabeth Harper? And why did someone spend 46 years trying to keep the truth hidden? The notebook was taken for forensic analysis. Every page was examined. Every mark was studied. Every hidden detail was investigated. Because inside those faded pages could be the final piece of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for almost half a century. And as experts examined the writing, they discovered something that would send the case into its most shocking chapter yet. A secret message. A confession hidden in plain sight. And a revelation that would change everything investigators thought they knew about the night Elizabeth Harper vanished. The notebook sat inside the evidence room for 3 days before anyone was willing to say what it might mean. 3 days of silence. 3 days of investigators staring at faded pages that had survived almost half a century. Because everyone understood the weight of what they were holding. This was not just an old notebook. It was a possible window into the darkest night in Michigan history. October 14th, 1979. The night Elizabeth Harper disappeared. The night a young woman vanished without leaving behind a clear answer. The night that turned an ordinary town into a place filled with fear. For decades, police had searched for the missing pieces. A witness. A weapon. A confession. A reason. And now, inside a small worn notebook belonging to Thomas Keller, investigators believe they had finally found connection. But cold cases are never solved by one discovery alone. They are solved by thousands of small details finally pointing in the same direction. The forensic team carefully examined every page. The notebook was old. The paper had become fragile. The ink had faded. Some words were almost impossible to read. But modern technology allowed experts to recover information that the human eye could no longer see. Using advanced imaging techniques, analysts enhanced the pages. They searched for erased writing, hidden impressions, marks left behind from previous notes, and what they discovered made the entire investigation freeze. One page contained a series of dates. Most appeared meaningless. Random numbers, random locations, random reminders. But one entry stood out. A date, a location, and initials. The date was October 14th, 1979. The location was near the same area where Elizabeth Harper's vehicle had been found, and the initials written beside it matched Elizabeth's name, Eaka. Investigators immediately questioned whether Keller had been documenting his movements, or whether he had been recording information about someone else. Either possibility was disturbing, because Keller had spent decades claiming he had no connection to Elizabeth. Yet evidence continued to place him closer and closer to the truth. The notebook became the focus of the entire investigation. Detectives studied the handwriting. They compared it with other documents written by Keller over the years. Employment paperwork, personal letters, old forms. The results confirmed something investigators had hoped for. The writing belonged to Thomas Keller. The notebook was his. The entries were his. The questions were now impossible to ignore. Why was Elizabeth Harper's name written inside? Why was the location connected to the crime scene? And why had Keller never mentioned any of this? The answers remained hidden, but investigators believed they were getting closer. They began searching through Keller's history with a new perspective, not just looking for evidence of guilt, looking for patterns. They examined his life after 1979, his relationships, his movements, his behavior, and they discovered something unexpected. Several years after Elizabeth disappeared, Keller had a close relationship with a woman named Diane Porter. Diane had never been interviewed during the original investigation because nobody knew she mattered. But when detectives located her decades later, she revealed something that changed the case. She remembered Keller talking about Elizabeth, not once, but several times. According to Diane, Keller would become unusually quiet whenever Elizabeth Harper's name appeared in the news. She remembered asking him why he seemed interested in the case. His response bothered her. He allegedly said, "Some things from the past should stay buried." At the time, Diane thought he was talking about something personal. Everyone had secrets. Everyone had regrets. But years later, after hearing about the fingerprint discovery, she contacted investigators. She said she had carried that memory for decades. A sentence she could never forget. A sentence that now seemed terrifying. Investigators recorded her statement. They knew witnesses from the past were rare. Many people connected to the case had already passed away. Every remaining memory mattered. Every surviving voice mattered. Because Elizabeth Harper's story had waited 46 years for people to finally listen, the investigation continued to expand. Detectives returned to the original crime scene again. This time, they were not searching blindly. They had direction. They had technology. They had a suspect. The wooded area surrounding the old service road had changed dramatically since 1979. New trees had grown. The ground had shifted. The landscape had transformed. But beneath the surface, the past remained. Forensic teams used modern scanning equipment to examine areas that had never been properly searched. The search lasted several days. Then, near a section of land not far from where Elizabeth's vehicle was discovered, investigators found another piece of evidence, a small metallic object, weathered, damaged, but recognizable. It was part of a necklace. Elizabeth Harper had been wearing a necklace the night she disappeared. Her family remembered it clearly. A simple piece of jewelry she rarely removed. The item was carefully collected, sent for testing. And when Elizabeth's family was notified, the news was devastating. Because after decades of uncertainty, they were forced to confront the possibility they had feared. Elizabeth was not coming home. The mystery that had tormented them for nearly half a century was finally revealing its darkest truth. But for investigators, the discovery raised even more questions. How did the necklace get there? Who buried it? And why had nobody found it before? The answer appeared to connect back to Thomas Keller. The location was close to an area Keller frequently visited in 1979, a place he had access to, a place where few people would have had a reason to go. The evidence was building, but prosecutors needed more. A fingerprint, a notebook, a witness statement, a piece of jewelry. These were powerful clues. But 46-year-old murder case required undeniable evidence. Investigators turned toward the most advanced forensic tool available, DNA analysis. The necklace fragment, the fabric recovered near the service road, the evidence from Elizabeth's abandoned vehicle. All of it was examined again. Technology had changed the world of criminal investigations. Evidence that was impossible to analyze in 1979 could now reveal the truth. The testing process began, and the wait became unbearable, because everyone knew the result could decide the fate of the entire case. If the DNA connected Elizabeth to the recovered evidence, the disappearance would finally become a confirmed homicide. If the DNA connected Keller, the man who had lived quietly for decades would become the center of one of Michigan's most shocking criminal investigations. Days passed, then weeks. The forensic laboratory continued working, and while investigators waited, another discovery emerged. A forgotten photograph from Keller's old property. A photograph that had nothing to do with Elizabeth at first glance. It showed a group of people standing outside a repair shop in 1979. Thomas Keller was in the image, but detectives noticed something else. In the background was a vehicle, a dark pickup truck, the same style, the same damage near the rear bumper, the same truck connected to the witness statement from the night Elizabeth disappeared. The photograph did not prove everything, but it added another piece to the growing picture. The investigation was no longer chasing a ghost. It was following a trail that began with a fingerprint, a trail that led to a notebook, a trail that was now pointing toward a horrifying possibility. That Elizabeth Harper's final moments were never a mystery to one person. They were only a mystery to everyone else. And as the DNA results moved closer, the entire state of Michigan waited, because after 46 years of unanswered questions, the truth was finally approaching. And when the results arrived, they would reveal a secret that had been hidden since 1979. The phone call came before sunrise, a quiet morning, a nearly empty police station, and one message that would finally decide the fate of a mystery that had survived for 46 years. The DNA results were back. For decades, Elizabeth Harper's family had lived with uncertainty. They had lived between two impossible realities, one where she was gone forever, and another where she might somehow walk to the front door again. That hope had kept them alive. But now, investigators were preparing to deliver the truth, a truth that would finally answer what happened on that October night in 1979. The forensic report was opened inside the investigation room. Detectives gathered around the table. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to be the first person to say the words out loud, because after decades of searching, the evidence had finally connected the past to present. The DNA recovered from a necklace fragment belonged to Elizabeth Harper. There was no longer any doubt. The young woman who disappeared from a Michigan parking lot had not simply left. She had been killed. The missing person case was officially transformed into a homicide investigation. A cold case that had remained frozen for generations suddenly became one of the most active investigations in the state. But the DNA discovery created another question, a more important question. Who was responsible? Investigators already had their answer in mind. Thomas Keller. The man connected through the fingerprint. The man linked to the truck. The man whose notebook contained unexplained references to the night Elizabeth vanished. But suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed to prove that Keller was the person behind the crime. And they knew the clock was moving faster than ever. Keller was now an elderly man. His health had deteriorated. Every day mattered. Every hour mattered. The investigators returned to his past. They searched for the one thing that could connect him directly to Elizabeth's final moments. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A retired mechanic named Alan Brooks. Brooks had worked at the same repair shop as Thomas Keller in 1979. For decades, He had never spoken publicly about Elizabeth Harper's disappearance. But after seeing the new investigation reports, he contacted police. He said there was something he remembered, something that had bothered him for 46 years. The night Elizabeth disappeared, Keller arrived at work the next morning later than usual. He looked exhausted. His clothing was dirty, and there was something unusual about his truck. Brooks remembered that the interior had been completely cleaned. At the time, he assumed Keller was simply taking care of his vehicle. But years later, after hearing about the reopened case, the memory returned. Brooks told detectives, "I remember thinking it was strange. He never cleaned that truck." That statement immediately became important because investigators already knew the truck was connected to the case. They already knew a witness had seen a similar vehicle near the service road. They already knew Keller had a fingerprint inside Elizabeth's abandoned vehicle. Now they had someone who remembered Keller acting differently immediately after the disappearance. The pieces were coming together, but Keller still refused to admit anything. When investigators questioned him again, his answers became increasingly inconsistent. At first, he claimed he had never interacted with Elizabeth. Then he admitted he might have helped her with a minor vehicle issue. Then he claimed he could not remember. The timeline kept changing. The story kept shifting. And investigators recognized a pattern. A person telling the truth usually remembers the important details. A person hiding something often remembers only what they cannot avoid. The interview lasted several hours. Detectives asked about the fingerprint, the notebook, the truck, the witness statements, the recovered evidence. Keller denied involvement. He insisted he was being blamed because investigators had nothing else. But detectives knew they had something. They had time. They had patience. And they had science. The forensic team continued examining evidence from Keller's property. The notebook became more important than ever. Experts analyzed the pages again. They found hidden impressions beneath the original writing, marks left by previous entries, information that had been erased. Using advanced techniques, investigators recovered faint words that had never been visible. One sentence appeared beneath the surface, a sentence written decades earlier, a sentence that changed the investigation. It referenced a location near the service road, and beside it were words that suggested Keller knew Elizabeth had been there. The discovery sent shockwaves through the case, because for the first time, investigators believed they had evidence showing Keller was not simply connected to Elizabeth. He was connected to the location where her final moments occurred. The prosecutor's office began reviewing the case. They examined every piece of evidence, every statement, every timeline, every forensic result. They knew the public wanted an arrest. The family wanted closure. But they also knew something else. A wrongful accusation would destroy the entire investigation. They needed a case that could survive in court. A case strong enough to prove what happened after 46 years. Meanwhile, the story spread across the country. The headlines returned. Michigan cold case breakthrough after 46 years. DNA discovery reopens Elizabeth Harper murder investigation. Forgotten fingerprint leads detectives to hidden suspect. People who had forgotten the name Elizabeth Harper suddenly remembered. The town where she disappeared became the center of national attention. Old residents spoke about the fear that followed the case. Young people learned about the mystery their parents had whispered about for decades. The disappearance that had once been a local tragedy became a symbol of something larger, a reminder that some cases never truly disappear. They wait. They survive. They remain hidden until someone finds a missing piece. For Elizabeth's family, the news was painful. The DNA result answered the question they had feared, but it also gave them something they had never had: certainty. For 46 years, they wondered. Now they knew. Their daughter, their sister, their loved one had been taken from them. But they also knew investigators were closer than ever to holding someone responsible. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when detectives confronted Thomas Keller with complete evidence. The fingerprint, the DNA, the witness accounts, the recovered objects, the timeline. Everything. The interview room was quiet. Keller sat across from investigators. An elderly man facing questions about a crime committed before many people in the investigation team were even born. The detectives placed the evidence file on the table. They told him the truth. They told him the evidence had survived. They told him the past had finally caught up. For several minutes, Keller said nothing. He stared at the documents, at the photographs, at the evidence that had defeated decades of silence. A sentence that suggested the truth had been buried inside him for all those years. A sentence that would change the entire case. Because after 46 years of denial, Thomas Keller was finally ready to talk. For 46 years, Thomas Keller had carried the secret. A secret hidden behind ordinary conversations. Behind a quiet life. Behind decades of pretending that October 14th, 1979, was just another night. But inside that interrogation room, surrounded by evidence that time had failed to destroy, the past was finally closing in. The detectives watched every movement, every expression, every pause, because sometimes the smallest reaction reveals more than words. Keller looked down at the photographs spread across the table. Elizabeth Harper's vehicle, the service road, the recovered necklace fragment, the fingerprint report, the evidence that had survived longer than anyone expected. For decades, Keller believed the investigation would remain frozen forever. He believed the unanswered questions would disappear with time. But he had underestimated one thing. Time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes it protects it. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes, decades later, it brings the truth back. The interview continued. Detectives asked him about Elizabeth. At first, Keller repeated the same story. He claimed he barely knew her. He claimed the fingerprint had another explanation. He claimed the notebook entries were meaningless. But the investigators were prepared. They placed a timeline in front of him. They showed him the evidence. They explained every connection. The truck, the witness, the location, the DNA, the recovered items. One by one, the walls around his story began to collapse. Then detectives asked a question that changed everything. Why did you write her initials in your notebook? The room went silent. Keller looked away. For the first time, investigators saw something different. Not anger. Not confusion. Fear. A reaction they had been waiting for. The interview continued for hours. Keller attempted to explain. He said the initials were not Elizabeth Harper. He said the date was a coincidence. He said people were trying to create a story from meaningless information. But the more he talked, the more contradictions appeared. Detectives noticed something important. Keller knew details that had never been released publicly. Details about the investigation. Details about the scene. Details that only someone close to crime would know. That was the moment investigators realized they had reached the truth. Keller had not simply been near the case. He had been following it, watching it, remembering it. For 46 years, the investigation team returned to the original evidence one more time. They looked at every photograph, every statement, every piece of information. They discovered that one of the biggest mistakes in the original investigation was not a failure of effort. It was a failure of technology. In 1979, detectives did everything they could with the tools available. They searched. They interviewed. They collected evidence. But the science needed to reveal the truth did not exist yet. DNA testing was not advanced. Digital fingerprint databases did not exist. Modern forensic reconstruction was decades away. The evidence was there. The answer was there. But nobody had the ability to see it. Until now, the case became a symbol of a new era in criminal investigation, a reminder that old evidence can still speak, that forgotten files can still hold secrets, that victims can still have a voice, even after decades of silence. But while investigators prepared the case for prosecution, they continued digging into Keller's background. They wanted to understand who he was, not just as a suspect, but as a person. Because solving a crime requires more than knowing what happened. It requires understanding how it happened. And what they discovered created a disturbing picture. People who knew Keller in the late 1970s described him as someone who lived two different lives. To strangers, he was quiet, polite, hardworking, a man who repaired engines and kept to himself. But those close to him described another side, a person who could become controlling, a person who reacted aggressively when challenged, a person who hated losing control. Investigators believed that personality was important because Elizabeth Harper's disappearance appeared to involve planning. It was not random. The scene had been manipulated. Evidence had been moved. A vehicle had been abandoned in a way that created confusion. Someone wanted investigators searching in the wrong direction, and investigators believed that someone was Thomas Keller. The prosecutor's office began preparing charges, but they faced one major challenge: the amount of time that had passed. 46 years. Witnesses had aged. Memories had faded. Some people connected to the case had died. Documents had disappeared. The defense would argue that too much time had passed. They would question the evidence. They would challenge the investigation. So prosecutors needed a case built on science, not memories, not theories. Science. The DNA evidence became the foundation. The fingerprint became the connection. The notebook became the timeline. The witness statements became the confirmation. Together, they created a picture that was almost impossible to ignore. But investigators still wanted one final piece: a confession. Not because they needed it, but because Elizabeth Harper's family deserved to hear the truth from the person responsible. The detectives returned to Keller one final time. This time, the conversation was different. They did not accuse. They did not argue. They simply asked him to explain. They asked about Elizabeth's final moments. They asked what happened near the service road. They asked why he had kept silent. For several minutes, Keller stared at the table. Then he began speaking. At first, his words were unclear, broken. Fragments of memories mixed with excuses. But slowly, the story began to emerge. A story that investigators believed matched the evidence. A story that revealed what happened on that October night. According to Keller, he had encountered Elizabeth after she left work. He claimed their meeting was not planned. He claimed an argument happened. He claimed everything afterward was an accident. But investigators noticed something. His explanation did not match the evidence. Because the evidence showed preparation. It showed decisions. It showed actions taken after crime. Actions designed to hide the truth. The detectives listened carefully. They knew this moment was important. Every word mattered. Every detail mattered. Because after 46 years, Elizabeth Harper's final hours were finally being reconstructed. The young woman who disappeared under the Michigan night sky was no longer just a name in an old file. She was becoming a person again. A daughter. A friend. A woman with dreams that were stolen. And as Keller continued talking, investigators discovered the most disturbing part of the entire case. The disappearance of Elizabeth Harper was not caused by a stranger, not by a random encounter, but by someone who had been closer than anyone imagined, someone who had watched the investigation unfold, someone who had lived with the secret while the world searched. The truth was finally coming out, but the most shocking revelation was still ahead, because inside Keller's confession was a detail investigators never expected. A detail that explained why Elizabeth's case remained unsolved for so long, and why the person responsible believed he would never be caught. For decades, the people of Michigan wondered the same question. How could someone disappear without leaving behind the truth? How could a case with so many questions remain unanswered for 46 years? How could a person responsible for such a devastating crime continue living an ordinary life while an entire family waited for answers? The answer was finally beginning to emerge, and it was more disturbing than anyone imagined. Inside the interrogation room, Thomas Keller continued speaking, not with the confidence of someone who believed he had escaped, not with the certainty of someone who thought the past was gone, but with the exhaustion of someone who had carried a secret for far too long. Detectives listened carefully. Every sentence, every hesitation, every contradiction. Because after 46 years, the smallest details could reveal everything. Keller claimed the night Elizabeth disappeared began as an ordinary encounter. He said he had seen her near the parking lot. He said they had spoken briefly. He claimed he was only trying to help. But investigators knew something was wrong, because the evidence told a different story. The fingerprint inside Elizabeth's vehicle, the hidden notebook entries, the witness who saw his truck, the recovered necklace, the DNA evidence, all of it pointed toward one conclusion. Keller was not a stranger passing through Elizabeth's life. He was connected to the final moments before she vanished. The detectives asked him about the abandoned vehicle. Why was Elizabeth's car found miles away? Why were her personal belongings left behind? Why was the scene arranged the way it was? Keller struggled to answer. He gave explanations. But each explanation created another question, and investigators knew something important. A lie repeated for 46 years does not become the truth. It only becomes harder to maintain. The confession did not come all at once. There was no dramatic moment where Keller suddenly admitted everything. Instead, it came slowly, piece by piece. A detail here, a memory there, a sentence that revealed more than he intended. Investigators believe Keller had spent decades convincing himself that silence would protect him, that nobody would ever discover the truth. And for many years, he was almost right. The original investigation had reached dead ends. The evidence had remained locked away. Technology had not caught up. The case had become another forgotten cold case, sitting inside a police archive. But the world had changed. The science had changed. And the evidence Keller believed was meaningless had become the reason he was finally exposed. After the interview, investigators returned to the case files. They began creating a complete timeline, a timeline that connected every piece of evidence from 1979 to the present. October 14th, 1979. The final day Elizabeth Harper was seen alive. She arrived at work like normal. She completed her responsibilities. She spoke with co-workers. She left the building. Then she entered the parking lot. And somewhere between that moment and the discovery of her vehicle the next morning, everything changed. Investigators believe Keller approached her because he knew her routine. He knew where she worked. He knew when she left. He knew the area. That detail became one of the most frightening discoveries in the entire investigation. Elizabeth may not have been randomly chosen. She may have been watched. A thought that devastated her family, because it meant her disappearance was not a sudden event. It was something planned, something someone had time to think about. The investigation continued into Keller's personal history. Detectives wanted to know if Elizabeth was the only person connected to his disturbing behavior. They reviewed old records. They contacted former acquaintances, and they discovered a pattern of troubling incidents. Nothing that had ever led to a criminal conviction. Nothing that would have made authorities identify him as dangerous in 1979, but enough to raise questions. Several women who knew Keller described moments when he became possessive or threatening. Some remembered him becoming angry when he felt rejected. Others remembered him talking about control and revenge. Investigators believe these details helped explain the crime, not excuse it. Explain it. Because understanding a person's behavior can reveal how a crime was possible, but it cannot erase the damage left behind. For Elizabeth's family, the investigation was emotionally overwhelming. The case they had carried for nearly half a century was finally moving toward justice. But justice after decades comes with complicated emotions. There was relief. There was anger. There was grief. And there was a painful realization that while they were waiting for answers, the person responsible had been living freely, celebrating birthdays, growing older, building a life, while Elizabeth remained frozen in time. A 27-year-old woman forever remembered as a person who walked toward her car and never came home. The prosecutor's office officially announced that Thomas Keller would face charges connected to Elizabeth Harper's death. The announcement shocked the community. People who remember the case from childhood watched as history unfolded again. The headlines returned. 46-year mystery ends as elderly suspect charged. Fingerprint breakthrough leads to arrest in Michigan cold case. Family finally gets answers after decades of silence. But investigators knew the story was not over, because solving a cold case is not only about identifying a suspect. It is about proving the truth, and that meant preparing for a legal battle. Keller's defense team immediately challenged the evidence. They argued the fingerprint did not prove when it was placed there. They questioned the reliability of decades-old memories. They argued that the passage of time created uncertainty. But prosecutors were prepared. They knew the defense would focus on the years, the decades, the silence. So they focused on something stronger, the evidence, the science, the facts that survived. The fingerprint had a story. The DNA had a story. The notebook had a story. And together, those pieces told a devastating narrative, a story that began on a quiet October night in 1979. A story that continued through decades of unanswered questions. A story that finally reached the courtroom. Before the trial began, investigators made one final discovery. A piece of evidence that had been overlooked for years. Something hidden inside the original police reports. A handwritten note from the first detective assigned to Elizabeth's disappearance. A note that had never been fully investigated. A note mentioning a person seen near Elizabeth's vehicle before it was officially discovered. A name that connected directly back to Thomas Keller. For 46 years, that name had been buried inside the case file. Now it had returned, and it revealed something terrifying. The person responsible had been closer to the investigation than anyone ever realized. He had watched police search. He had listened to theories. He had seen the family suffer, and he had remained silent. But silence had finally failed. The cold case that had haunted Michigan for generations was no longer a mystery. The truth was finally standing in the light. And as the trial approached, the world waited to hear the final chapter of Elizabeth Harper's story. Because after 46 years, the woman who vanished would finally have her voice heard again. The courtroom was silent when Thomas Keller entered. Not the silence of uncertainty, not the silence of a mystery, but the heavy silence that comes when decades of unanswered questions finally arrive at their final destination. For 46 years, Elizabeth Harper's name had existed in a place between memory and reality. A missing person, a forgotten headline, a photograph on an old file, a face her family refused to let the world forget. Now, after nearly half a century, her story was finally being told again. But this time, not as a mystery, as a case, as evidence, as a search for justice. The prosecution knew the challenge ahead. Time had passed. A lifetime had passed. Many people who remembered the original investigation were gone. Some evidence had been damaged by age. Some memories had faded. But one thing remained unchanged. The evidence collected from 1979. The evidence that waited silently until science caught up. The trial began with a simple statement from prosecutors. The truth had never disappeared. It had only been hidden. The first evidence presented was the fingerprint, the tiny mark that changed everything. A partial print recovered from the receipt inside Elizabeth Harper's abandoned vehicle. In 1979, investigators had preserved it. They had photographed it. They had documented it. But they had no way to identify it. 46 years later, technology finally gave that fingerprint a name. Thomas Keller. The prosecution explained how the fingerprint connected Keller to Elizabeth's final known location. The defense argued that the fingerprint could have been left at any time. They suggested Keller may have touched the receipt innocently, a reasonable possibility, a question that the jury needed to consider. But prosecutors were ready, because the fingerprint was only one piece of a much larger picture. Then came the DNA evidence. The courtroom became completely focused as forensic experts explained the testing process. The necklace fragment, the fabric recovered near the service road, the biological evidence that had survived decades underground. Every test pointed back to one undeniable fact. Elizabeth Harper had been at that location. The evidence confirmed what her family had feared. The disappearance had ended in tragedy, but it also confirmed something else. The person responsible had left behind traces that survived longer than the person's confidence. The prosecution presented the timeline. October 14, 1979. Elizabeth leaves work. A witness sees her near her vehicle. A dark pickup truck is reported near the service road. The next morning, her vehicle is found abandoned. The evidence disappears into storage. The case goes cold. Then decades later, the fingerprint match, the notebook discovery, the DNA breakthrough, the recovered evidence, the suspect identified. Every event connected like pieces of a puzzle finally assembled. The defense attempted to create doubt. They questioned the investigation. They questioned the witnesses. They questioned whether the evidence truly proved Keller's involvement. They reminded the jury that 46 years had passed. But the prosecution returned to one central point. Time had passed, but the evidence had survived, and evidence does not forget. One of the most emotional moments of the trial came when Elizabeth Harper's family spoke. Her sister walked slowly to the witness stand. She was older now, decades older than the woman who disappeared. She described the impact of losing Elizabeth, the birthdays without her, the holidays without her, the unanswered questions, the years spent wondering. She described keeping photographs, keeping memories, keeping hope. Because for a long time, accepting the possibility that Elizabeth was gone felt impossible. Then she looked toward the courtroom, and she said something that affected everyone inside. Elizabeth was not just a cold case. She was a person. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a life that mattered. The courtroom remained silent. Even the defense team looked down, because behind every piece of evidence was a human story. Behind every photograph was a person. Behind every file was a family that suffered. The trial continued for weeks. Experts analyzed evidence. Witnesses testified. Investigators explained the decades-long process of solving the case. Retired officers described the original investigation. They spoke about the frustration, the unanswered questions, the feeling that the truth was always close but unreachable. One retired detective became emotional while describing Elizabeth's case. He admitted that after many years, he wondered if the answer would ever come. But he also said something important. He said the case was never abandoned. It was never forgotten. It was waiting for the right evidence, the right technology, the right moment. As the trial reached its final days, prosecutors presented their strongest evidence: the notebook, the hidden writing recovered through forensic analysis, the entries connected to the night Elizabeth disappeared. The defense challenged the interpretation. They argued the notes were unclear, but prosecutors showed the jury the pattern, the location, the date, the connection, the impossible number of coincidences surrounding Thomas Keller. They argued that one coincidence could be ignored, two could be questioned, but dozens pointed toward the same truth. The jury began deliberations. The entire community waited. For years, people had wondered whether Elizabeth Harper would ever receive justice. Now the answer was hours away. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. The story had become national news. A cold case solved after 46 years. A fingerprint that survived decades. A family finally receiving answers. The world watched as a jury reviewed the evidence. Every piece, every detail, every moment from a case that began before modern forensic science existed. Then, after several hours, the courtroom doors opened. Everyone stood. The judge entered. The jury returned. Thomas Keller looked forward. The Harper family held their breath. The verdict was read. And after 46 years of waiting, the truth finally had a name. The jury found Thomas Keller guilty. The courtroom remained quiet, not because people were surprised, but because everyone understood the meaning of that moment. A case that had haunted Michigan since 1979 had finally reached its conclusion. A family that had waited nearly half a century finally heard the words they had dreamed of hearing. Justice had arrived. But even after the verdict, one question remained. Why? Why did Elizabeth Harper have to die? Why did the truth take 46 years to emerge? And why did the person responsible believe he could escape forever? The answers were hidden inside the final investigation reports, inside the evidence, inside the memories of those who knew Elizabeth. Because solving the crime was only part of the story. Understanding the impact of what happened was something else entirely. And as investigators closed the final chapters of the case, they uncovered one last revelation, a discovery that explained how Thomas Keller managed to hide the truth for so long. A discovery that showed just how close the original investigation had come to solving the mystery decades earlier. The cold case was solved, but the story of Elizabeth Harper was not over, because some cases do not end when the verdict is announced. Some cases continue living in the memories of the people left behind. The verdict was supposed to be the end. After 46 years of unanswered questions, investigators believed the final chapter of Elizabeth Harper's story had finally been written. Thomas Keller had been found guilty. The evidence had been heard. The jury had spoken. The family had finally received the justice they had waited a lifetime to see. But when the courtroom emptied and the cameras disappeared, something unexpected happened. The case did not disappear. Because some mysteries are not finished when a verdict is announced. Some mysteries continue to echo. Some names remain connected to a tragedy long after the final words are spoken. And for the people of Michigan, the Elizabeth Harper case became more than a solved crime. It became a reminder what can happen when time passes, when evidence is forgotten, and when the smallest overlooked detail can eventually bring the truth back into the light. The weeks following the conviction were filled with reflection. Investigators who had spent years rebuilding the case looked back at everything that had happened. The fingerprint, the DNA, the notebook, the witnesses, the evidence that had survived decades of silence. And they realized something that changed the way they viewed cold cases forever. The investigation had never truly ended. It had only paused. Back in 1979, detectives had walked through the same places. They had searched the same roads. They had asked many of the same questions. They had looked for Elizabeth. They had looked for the person responsible. But they were fighting against limitations that no longer existed. They had photographs but no digital enhancement. They had fingerprints but no advanced databases. They had biological evidence but no modern DNA technology. They had pieces of the puzzle, but they did not have the ability to see the complete picture. Decades later, a new generation of investigators picked up the same file. They were not looking for a miracle. They were looking for details. Because cold cases are often solved not by discovering something completely new, but by discovering something that was always there. The fingerprint was always there. The receipt was always there. The notebook was always there. The evidence had been waiting. And the most shocking part of the case was not that investigators finally found Thomas Keller. It was that the answer had been sitting inside the investigation for decades. Hidden. Ignored. Waiting. The original detectives who worked Elizabeth's disappearance carried the case with them for years. Some retired. Some passed away. But many remembered the feeling that something was missing, a piece they could not find, a connection they could not prove. One retired investigator spoke after conviction. He described Elizabeth's case as one of the most frustrating investigations of his career, not because police did nothing, but because they knew someone had answers. They just could not reach them. He explained that in 1979, investigators followed every lead available. They interviewed people. They searched locations. They collected evidence. They did everything possible with the tools they had. But criminals do not always fear the present. Sometimes they fear the future, because the evidence they leave behind may survive longer than their lives. That was exactly what happened with Thomas Keller. He believed time was protecting him, but time was actually preserving the evidence that would eventually expose him, the fingerprint that connected him, the DNA that confirmed the truth, the records that rebuilt the timeline, the memories that returned decades later. Everything he believed had disappeared was still there. The conviction also brought a painful moment of closure for Elizabeth's family. Closure did not mean forgetting. It did not erase 46 years of grief. It did not bring Elizabeth back. But it gave the family something they had never had, an answer. For decades, they lived with uncertainty. They wondered if Elizabeth had suffered. They wondered if someone knew what happened. They wondered if the person responsible was still alive, still walking the same streets, still living a normal life. Now they knew, and while the truth was painful, uncertainty had finally ended. Elizabeth Harper was remembered again, not as a missing person, not as a cold case file, but as a woman whose life mattered. Her family shared stories about who she was before the tragedy. They talked about her laugh, her kindness, her dreams, the things she loved. The person she had been before her name became connected to a crime, because behind every cold case headline is a human being. Behind every investigation is a family waiting. And behind every piece of evidence is a story that deserves to be heard. The community where Elizabeth disappeared also changed after the case was solved. People who had grown up hearing about the mystery finally understood what had happened. Residents who remembered the fear of 1979 reflected on how much the world had changed. The case became a lesson in persistence, a lesson that no investigation should ever be considered impossible. Because 46 years earlier, many people believed Elizabeth Harper's story will remain unanswered forever. They were wrong. The breakthrough came from something incredibly small, a fingerprint, a mark left by a human hand, something invisible to most people, something forgotten inside an evidence box. But that tiny detail became the key that unlocked everything. Investigators later described it as one of the most powerful examples of modern forensic science, a reminder that evidence does not expire. It waits. It remains. It tells the truth when people cannot. But even after conviction, one question continued to haunt investigators. How many other cases were still waiting? How many forgotten pieces of evidence were sitting inside old storage rooms? How many families were still waiting for someone to look again? The Elizabeth Harper case became a symbol for countless unsolved investigations across America. Cases where victims had names, families had memories, and answers were still somewhere in the darkness. The message from investigators was clear. Cold cases are not dead cases. They are unfinished stories. And sometimes, after decades of silence, one discovery can change everything. A fingerprint, a DNA match, a forgotten photograph, a witness who finally speaks. One small piece can bring an entire truth back to life. Years after the verdict, detectives continued reviewing the evidence, not because they doubted a conviction, but because they wanted to understand every detail. They wanted to know exactly how Keller managed to hide the truth for so long. They wanted to understand the choices that allowed the crime to remain unsolved. And through that process, they discovered something chilling. Keller had not escaped because he was a criminal genius. He escaped because the world had not yet developed the tools to expose him. He relied on time. He relied on silence. He relied on the belief that old evidence would become useless. But he was wrong. The evidence remembered, and eventually it spoke. The final report on the Elizabeth Harper investigation contained thousands of pages, photographs, statements, forensic results, every piece documenting the journey from disappearance to justice. At the beginning of the file was the original missing person report from 1979. At the end was a conviction. 46 years separated those two moments. 46 years of searching. 46 years of waiting. 46 years of a family refusing to let Elizabeth be forgotten. And when investigators finally closed the case, they left one final note, a sentence that captured the entire investigation. The truth may be delayed, but it is not defeated. Because in Michigan, one cold case proved something the world often forgets. The past never truly disappears. It waits. It watches. And sometimes, decades later, it comes back for the truth. Michigan 1979 cold case solved. Shocking DNA discovery ends 46-year mystery. 46 years is a lifetime. It is enough time for children to grow old, for neighborhoods to change, for buildings to disappear, for memories to fade. It is enough time for people to believe that certain questions will never be answered, but the story of Elizabeth Harper proved something different. Some questions do not disappear. Some wounds do not close. Some cases do not die. They wait. They remain hidden beneath layers of paperwork, forgotten evidence, and years of silence. And sometimes, when nobody expects it, the truth returns. The final days of the investigation were not filled with celebration. There was no feeling of victory, because everyone involved understood what had been lost. A conviction could not return Elizabeth Harper to her family. A courtroom decision could not erase 46 years of pain. Justice could not rewrite history, but it could do something important. It could finally give Elizabeth a voice. For decades, Elizabeth existed inside a question mark, a photograph, a missing person report, a name attached to an unsolved mystery. But after the investigation ended, people began remembering the woman she was before the tragedy. They remembered Elizabeth as a person, not as a case file, not as a headline, not as a symbol of something terrible. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman with plans, a woman with dreams, a woman whose life was interrupted on a quiet October night in 1979. The investigators who solved the case often returned to one thought. The smallest detail changed everything. Not a dramatic discovery, not a hidden confession found immediately, not a single moment where everything became obvious. It was a fingerprint, a tiny mark left behind by a person who believed nobody would ever find it. That fingerprint survived 4 decades of uncertainty. It survived changing investigators. It survived outdated technology. It survived the belief that the truth was gone forever. But fingerprints do not care how much time passes. DNA does not forget. Evidence does not lose its memory. And that became the greatest lesson of the Elizabeth Harper investigation. The truth can become buried, but it is extremely difficult to destroy. After the conviction, investigators reviewed the entire timeline one final time. They looked back at the night Elizabeth disappeared. They looked at every decision made, every mistake, every missed opportunity, every moment when the investigation came close. And they discovered something that remained haunting. The original investigators had been closer than they realized. The evidence was not absent. It was incomplete. The fingerprint existed. The witness existed. The vehicle connection existed. The suspicious behavior existed. The pieces were scattered across decades of investigation. The problem was that nobody knew how they fit together until technology changed everything. The case became a powerful example of how modern forensic science has transformed criminal investigations. In 1979, investigators relied heavily on interviews, physical searches, and traditional evidence collection. They walked through forests. They knocked on doors. They followed rumors. They searched for witnesses. They did everything possible. But some answers were beyond their reach. The science needed to uncover the truth simply did not exist yet. 46 years later, it did. And when investigators returned to the evidence, they were no longer looking at old objects. They were looking at messages from the past. The receipt was not just paper. It was a record of contact. The necklace fragment was not just an object. It was a connection to Elizabeth's final moments. The notebook was not just writing. It was a hidden timeline. Every piece had something to say. And together, those pieces revealed the story that had been waiting all along. The community also carried the impact of the case for years. Many residents remembered exactly where they were when Elizabeth disappeared. They remembered the fear that spread through the town. They remembered parents warning children not to walk alone. They remembered conversations held quietly behind closed doors. Because a disappearance changes a community. It creates a before and after. Before Elizabeth vanished. After Elizabeth vanished. For 46 years, the town lived with that memory. The case became part of local history. A story passed from one generation to another. A reminder that somewhere, someone still needed answers. When the cold case was finally solved, many residents described the feeling as complicated. There was relief. There was sadness. There was anger. There was disbelief that the answer had been hidden for so long. But there was also gratitude. Gratitude that Elizabeth's name had not been forgotten. Gratitude that investigators continued searching. Gratitude that modern science gave the past another chance. The story of Elizabeth Harper also changed the way many people viewed cold cases. For years, some believed old investigations were impossible to solve. Too much time had passed. Too much evidence was gone. Too many people had forgotten. But Elizabeth's case proved the opposite. A cold case is not an abandoned case. It is an unfinished case. The passage of time does not always make the truth weaker. Sometimes it makes the truth stronger, because every year creates new technology. Every decade creates new methods. Every generation of investigators brings a different perspective. The person responsible may believe the world has moved on, but the evidence remains, waiting. The final investigation report contained one of the most emotional statements from detectives involved. They wrote that Elizabeth Harper's case represented thousands of victims whose stories remained unresolved, people who disappeared, people whose families waited, people whose names sat inside forgotten files. The message was clear. Every victim matters. Every case matters. Every piece of evidence matters. Because sometimes the difference between a mystery and an answer is one overlooked detail. One person deciding to look again. One investigator refusing to give up. One piece of evidence finally understood. The Elizabeth Harper case also left behind a warning. The passage of time can create the illusion of safety. It can make people believe they escaped. It can make secrets feel permanent. But time is unpredictable. The same years that protect a secret can also destroy it. Thomas Keller spent decades believing the past was behind him. He built a life. He grew older. He watched the world change. But the evidence remained connected to that night. The fingerprint remained. The truth remained. And eventually, the past returned, not with anger, not with revenge, but with facts, with science, with undeniable evidence. That is what made the case so powerful. It was not solved because someone remembered perfectly. It was not solved because of luck. It was solved because the truth had been preserved. And when the right moment arrived, it finally emerged. Today, the name Elizabeth Harper represents more than a tragedy. It represents perseverance. It represents the families who continue searching. It represents investigators who refuse to close the book. It represents the idea that justice does not have an expiration date. 46 years after Elizabeth disappeared, her story reached the ending her family had waited for. Not the ending anyone wanted, but the ending they needed. A mystery became an answer. A cold case became a solved case. A forgotten fingerprint became the key. And a woman who had been silent for decades finally received justice. Because the truth can hide. The truth can wait. The truth can be buried beneath years of silence. But the truth has one thing that secrets do not: time. And sometimes, after 46 years of darkness, the smallest piece of evidence can become the light that reveals everything. The investigation may have ended inside a courtroom, but the echoes of Elizabeth Harper's case continued far beyond the final verdict. Because some stories do not disappear when the suspect is convicted. Some stories remain because they represent something larger. A reminder that every missing person has a family. Every forgotten file has a human story. Every piece of evidence has the potential to change everything. For the investigators who worked the case, the conviction of Thomas Keller was not simply a legal victory. It was a promise fulfilled. A promise made decades earlier when Elizabeth's name first entered the police system. A promise that someone would keep searching, even when the headlines disappeared, even when the public moved on, even when the case became another cold file sitting in storage. The investigators who reopened the case understood something important. Cold cases are not solved by one person. They are solved by generations. One detective collects the evidence. Another detective discovers the pattern. Another investigator finds the technology. Another person sees what everyone else missed. The solution to a 46-year mystery was built across decades. A chain of people who refused to let Elizabeth Harper become just another forgotten name. The original officers who responded in 1979 could never have imagined what would happen decades later. They could not have imagined a fingerprint database powerful enough to identify a mark left behind nearly half a century earlier. They could not have imagined DNA technology capable of finding answers from evidence buried for decades. They could not have imagined that the photographs they took, the notes they wrote, and the evidence they stored would one day return as the foundation of a solved case. But that is the strange reality of investigations. The future often solves the mysteries of past. The evidence collected in one generation can become the answer discovered by another. And for Elizabeth Harper, that answer finally arrived. After the case was closed, investigators revisited the location where her vehicle was discovered. The service road was no longer the same. The trees had changed. The surrounding land had changed. New roads had been built. Old buildings had disappeared. But standing there, investigators could still feel the weight of what happened, because places remember, even when people forget. That road had once been the center of a desperate search, a place where volunteers walked for hours, a place where officers searched through darkness, a place where a family received the devastating news that Elizabeth's vehicle had been found. But now, decades later, it represented something different. It represented the moment when the truth finally began to emerge. The investigators placed flowers near the area in memory of Elizabeth, not as a celebration, not as a victory, but as a final acknowledgement, a recognition that behind the evidence, behind the investigation, behind the headlines, there was a person, Elizabeth Harper, a woman whose life mattered, a woman whose story deserved to be completed. The case also changed the way many law enforcement agencies approached old investigations. Departments across Michigan began reviewing archive cases. Files that had been untouched for years were opened again. Evidence boxes that had collected dust were examined with new technology. Because the Elizabeth Harper investigation proved one thing: a case that appears impossible today may become solvable tomorrow. Technology continues to evolve. Methods continue to improve. And evidence that seems useless can suddenly become the most important piece of the puzzle. That is why investigators often repeat one phrase: never throw away the past, because the past may contain the answer. The Harper case also revealed something darker. The person responsible did not escape because he was invisible. He escaped because the investigation world of 1979 was different. He relied on time. He relied on silence. He relied on the belief that nobody would ever connect the evidence. For decades, that belief protected him. But eventually the world changed. The tools changed. The questions changed. And the evidence that once seemed powerless became impossible to ignore. The fingerprint that sat quietly inside an evidence file became the moment everything collapsed. One tiny mark. One human touch. One mistake that survived longer than the person who made it expected. That single fingerprint became the bridge between 1979 and the present. Between a missing person investigation and a murder conviction, between a family's unanswered questions and the truth they desperately needed. The story of Elizabeth Harper also left a message for families of missing people everywhere. Never stop searching. Never assume silence means the truth is gone. Never believe that time automatically wins, because sometimes the answer is still out there, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for someone to look again, waiting for the moment when everything finally makes sense. For Elizabeth's family, the journey lasted almost an entire lifetime. They spent years wondering, years hoping, years asking questions that had no answers. But they never allowed her memory to disappear. They kept photographs. They kept stories. They kept her name alive. And that became one of the most important parts of the case. Because investigations may begin with evidence, but they continue because people care. Because someone refuses to forget. Because someone believes that a missing person deserves to come home, even if that home is finally the truth. The final report on the case closed with the words investigators had waited decades to write. Solved. A word that seemed impossible in 1979. A word that represented years of work, years of patience, years of waiting. But even with the case solved, one fact remained. Nothing could undo what happened. Nothing could restore the years Elizabeth lost. Nothing could erase the pain carried by her family. Justice does not change the past. It simply acknowledges it. It tells the victim's story. It holds someone accountable. And it reminds the world that every life has value. The Michigan cold case that began with a disappearance ended with a discovery, a fingerprint, a DNA match, a hidden truth, a mystery that survived 46 years, finally brought into the light. And perhaps the most haunting part of the entire story is this. For decades, Thomas Keller believed he had left no answers behind. He believed the years would protect him. He believed the evidence would disappear. But he was wrong. Because every action leaves something behind. Every decision creates a trail. Every secret carries a weakness. And sometimes, the smallest forgotten detail becomes the one thing that brings everything crashing down. 46 years after Elizabeth Harper vanished, the silence ended. The questions stopped. The investigation closed. But her story remained. A story of loss. A story of persistence. A story of justice delayed but never destroyed. Because some cold cases are not forgotten. They are simply waiting for the moment when the truth is ready to be found. Even after the official investigation ended, the name Elizabeth Harper continued to appear in conversations about justice, perseverance, and the power of modern forensic science, because her case represented something that many people struggled to understand. How could a mystery survive for 46 years? How could a person vanish, leaving behind evidence that nobody could fully understand? How could the truth remain hidden for so long? The answer was simple and terrifying, because sometimes the truth is not missing. Sometimes it is simply waiting for someone to recognize it. For decades, Elizabeth Harper's file remained untouched in the archives. A thick folder filled with photographs, reports, interviews, and unanswered questions. Inside were the details of a night that changed everything. The parking lot, the abandoned vehicle, the missing woman, the terrified family, the investigators who searched through the darkness. Every page carried the weight of a story that never received its ending, until technology opened the door again. The final review of the case revealed something investigators often see in old investigations. The answer was not hidden in one dramatic discovery. It was hidden in hundreds of small details. A fingerprint collected decades earlier, a witness statement that seemed unimportant, a forgotten notebook, a photograph that nobody noticed, a piece of evidence that waited silently while the world moved forward. Each piece alone was incomplete, but together they formed a picture that showed what happened to Elizabeth Harper, and a picture that exposed the person who believed he would never be discovered. The investigators who worked the reopened case later admitted that one of the most emotional moments was not the arrest. It was a moment they finally understood Elizabeth's final hours. For decades, the family wondered what happened after she walked toward her vehicle. They imagined countless possibilities. They lived with uncertainty. And uncertainty can become its own kind of suffering, because grief without answers is different. There is no final moment, no explanation, no place to put the pain, only questions. But when investigators reconstructed the timeline, they gave the family something they had never received: the truth. A painful truth, a devastating truth, but a truth. And sometimes, after decades of searching, the truth is the only thing that can finally bring peace. The case also changed how investigators viewed old evidence. In the past, evidence was often considered valuable only if it could immediately solve a crime. But modern investigations change that idea. Evidence can wait. Evidence can survive. Evidence can become more powerful with time. The fingerprint inside Elizabeth's vehicle was not valuable because it was discovered. It was valuable because someone finally understood what it meant. That difference changed everything. A piece of evidence is only as powerful as the person who knows how to use it. And in the Elizabeth Harper case, decades separated the discovery from the answer. The investigators who solved the case often thought about the person responsible, not with curiosity, not with sympathy, but with one question: how could someone live with such a secret for so long? How could someone wake up every morning knowing the truth? How could someone see Elizabeth's family searching, waiting, hoping, and remain silent? The answer may never fully be understood, but investigators believed one thing. The passage of time created confidence. Confidence created mistakes. And, eventually, those mistakes created the evidence that exposed everything. Because criminals often believe time is their greatest protection. They believe people forget. They believe evidence disappears. They believe memories fade. And sometimes they are right. But sometimes they are completely wrong. Sometimes the smallest mistake survives. Sometimes a single fingerprint defeats decades of silence. Sometimes the truth waits longer than anyone expects. The story of Elizabeth Harper became a reminder to families across the country who still wait for answers. A reminder that an unsolved case does not mean an unsolvable case. Every year, technology improves. Every year, investigators discover new ways to examine old evidence. Every year, cases once considered impossible return to life. Because justice does not always move quickly. Sometimes justice takes years. Sometimes decades. But time does not erase the responsibility to find the truth. The final days of the investigation were filled with emotion. Detectives who had spent years working the case finally placed Elizabeth's file into the solved category. A word that carried enormous meaning. Solved. A word her family had waited almost half a century to hear. But even as the file was closed, investigators knew the story would continue, because Elizabeth Harper's case became part of something larger. A reminder of the importance of never forgetting victims. A reminder that every name on a missing person report belongs to someone. Someone loved. Someone remembered. Someone whose story deserves an ending. Years after conviction, investigators continued receiving messages from people affected by the case. Some had followed the story since 1979. Others discovered it after breakthrough. Many said the same thing. They were shocked that a case could survive so long and still be solved. But investigators were not surprised. They had seen it before. They knew that evidence has a strange way of returning. They knew that the past is never completely gone. It remains inside old photographs, inside old reports, inside memories, inside the objects people leave behind. And eventually, someone finds the right piece, the right question, the right connection. The story of Elizabeth Harper began with a disappearance. A young woman leaving work. A car found abandoned. A family waiting. A town searching. A mystery growing darker with every passing year. But it ended with something else. A discovery. A breakthrough. A truth finally revealed. A cold case solved. The phrase that once seemed impossible became reality. After 46 years, investigators finally answered the question that had haunted Michigan for generations. What happened to Elizabeth Harper? And who was responsible? The answer came from a place nobody expected. A forgotten fingerprint. A silent witness left behind by a moment in time. A tiny piece of evidence that carried a message across decades. The message was simple. The truth was still there. It had never disappeared. It had only been waiting. And when the world finally looked again, it spoke. The story of Elizabeth Harper did not end when the courtroom doors closed, because some cases leave behind more than a verdict. They leave behind questions about time, about memory, about the thin line between a mystery and an answer. For the investigators who uncovered the truth, the Elizabeth Harper case became a reminder that every cold case has a heartbeat. Every file contains a moment frozen in time, a moment when someone disappeared, a moment when a family's world changed forever, and a moment when someone believed they had escaped the consequences. But the passage of time created something nobody expected. It created another opportunity. The same years that allowed a secret to survive also allowed technology to advance. The same decades that buried the evidence also preserved it. The same silence that protected the person responsible eventually became the reason investigators had the chance to find the truth, because silence leaves patterns, and patterns can be discovered. After the conviction, investigators continued studying the case. not because they questioned the outcome, not because they doubted the evidence, but because they wanted to understand every moment, every decision, every missed opportunity. They wanted future investigators to learn from Elizabeth's story. They wanted other families waiting for answers to know that their cases still mattered. Inside the original investigation files were hundreds of pages, witness statements, handwritten notes, crime scene photographs, evidence reports, documents created by people who never knew whether their work would ever lead to an answer. Some investigators who handled the case early in the process never saw the final result. They retired believing the truth might never be discovered, but their work mattered. Their evidence mattered. Their dedication mattered. Because solving a cold case is often a relay race across generations. One person carries the evidence forward. Another person finds a missing connection. Another person discovers the breakthrough. And eventually, the finish line appears. For Elizabeth Harper, that finish line came 46 years later. The investigation also revealed a painful reality about forgotten cases. Time changes everything. Witnesses grow older. Memories become harder to trust. Physical locations transform. People move away. Records disappear. But certain things remain stronger than time. Science. Evidence. Truth. That became the foundation of the investigation. Not rumors. Not speculation. Not emotion. Facts. The fingerprint was a fact. The DNA was a fact. The evidence recovered from the scene was a fact. And together, those facts created a story that could no longer be ignored. The people of Michigan continued to remember Elizabeth. Years after the case was solved, her name remained connected to a lesson that investigators hoped would never be forgotten. A victim is never just a headline. A victim is never just a photograph attached to a file. A victim is a person whose future was taken away. A person who had dreams. A person who had people waiting for them. A person whose story deserves to be told. Elizabeth Harper's story became a reminder that justice is not measured only by how quickly it arrives. Sometimes justice is measured by whether people refuse to stop searching. Because for 46 years, someone kept looking. Someone kept asking questions. Someone kept believing that the answer existed somewhere. And eventually, they were proven right. The most haunting part of the case was not the fact that evidence survived. It was the fact that the evidence had been waiting in silence. The fingerprint had no voice. The photograph had no voice. The notebook had no voice. The objects connected to Elizabeth could not speak. But they carried information. They carried history. They carried the truth. And when investigators finally understood what they were seeing, the entire case changed. A disappearance became a homicide. A mystery became an investigation. A cold case became a solved case. And a forgotten file became a story of justice. The final chapter of Elizabeth Harper's case was not about the person responsible. It was about the person who was lost. It was about remembering the life that existed before the tragedy. The family gatherings. The friendships. The ordinary moments that made Elizabeth who she was. Because the most important thing about a cold case is not the suspect. It is the victim. The person whose life deserves to be remembered. The person whose name deserves to be spoken. The person whose story deserves an ending. Elizabeth Harper disappeared in 1979, but she was never forgotten. Her name survived. Her story survived. And eventually, the truth survived. The case that once represented uncertainty became a symbol of hope for families around the world. A reminder that even after decades of silence, answers can still be found. A reminder that technology can reach into the past. A reminder that evidence can outlast lies. A reminder that justice may be delayed, but it does not disappear. Because every cold case carries a possibility. Every forgotten file carries a question. Every piece of evidence carries a story. And somewhere, hidden inside those unanswered stories, there may be the one detail that changes everything. For Elizabeth Harper, that detail was a fingerprint. A single mark left behind decades earlier. A mark that connected the past to the present. A mark that proved one simple truth. The truth had been there all along. It was waiting for someone to find it.